Late at night in a quiet Virginia town, two police officers pulled over a black woman, accusing her of a crime she didn't commit. What should have been a routine stop quickly turned into something much darker, a carefully planned setup. But what the officers didn't know was that the woman they were targeting wasn't just anyone. She was a CIA agent with the power to expose everything they thought they controlled. This story takes a shocking turn, revealing a web of lies and corruption, and ends with a twist so explosive it would shake the entire police department to its core. The night was calm in Arlington, Virginia. Street lights flickered above empty sidewalks, and the occasional car sped down the quiet roads. Talia Porter sat behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV, her hands relaxed as she drove through the suburban neighborhood. Talia glanced at her watch, it was just past midnight. Her day had been long, but she felt a small sense of accomplishment. Her undercover work in the small town was almost done, and she had everything she needed to leave without a trace. As she approached a quiet intersection, she slowed down, her sharp eyes catching the faint glint of a reflective stop sign. Talia had a knack for noticing details, a skill she'd perfected over years as a field operative. She came to a full stop, her hands steady on the wheel, and then turned left onto the next street. Moments later, blue and red lights flashed behind her, their glow reflecting in her rearview mirror. The piercing wail of a siren broke the night's stillness. Talia's heart didn't race, she was trained for moments like this. Instead, her mind sharpened, and her breathing stayed calm. She glanced into the mirror and saw the squad car pulling closer, its headlights casting long shadows across her dashboard. With practiced ease, she guided her car to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and reached into the glove compartment for her license and registration. The patrol car stopped just behind her, its lights still flashing. Two officers stepped out, their movements deliberate. The driver, a tall man with a square jaw and an authoritative walk, approached first. His partner, shorter and stockier, followed close behind. Both wore the navy blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. Talia noted their names as they got closer: Officer Brandon Carter and Officer Mark Sullivan. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Carter said, his voice carrying a practiced authority. He leaned down slightly, shining his flashlight into her window. The beam swept across her face and the car's interior. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Talia kept her expression neutral, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." Officer Carter's lips twitched, a small, condescending smile tugging at the corners. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said. "That's a moving violation." Talia's brow furrowed slightly, but she stayed calm. She knew something wasn't right. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," Talia said, her tone calm but firm. "If you're mistaken," Carter cut her off, his voice hardening. "License and registration." Talia handed him the documents without hesitation, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't looking to escalate the situation. Carter examined her papers, his eyes lingering on her license. She could feel his scrutiny, the subtle change in his demeanor as he processed her information. "Virginia plates, local address," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, louder, he asked, "You live around here?" Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." Sullivan, who had been standing near the back of her car, suddenly called out, "Hey, Carter, you might want to take a look back here." Carter straightened, handing Talia's documents back without another word. "Stay in the car," he ordered before walking over to join his partner at the trunk of her SUV. Talia's jaw tightened as she watched them through her side mirror. Sullivan was pointing at something, his voice low and secretive. Carter nodded, and the two officers exchanged a look that made Talia uneasy. It wasn't fear, she rarely felt that, but a sharp, instinctual warning. Moments later, Carter returned to her window, his expression now serious. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Carter replied, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. Talia's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances," she repeated. "I think you've made a mistake." "We'll see about that," Carter said, gesturing for her to step out of the car. Sullivan was already waiting near the back of her car, a smug look on his face. Talia held back a sigh, opened the door, and stepped out. She moved slowly and deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching as Sullivan dramatically opened her trunk and pointed to a small, unmarked bag sitting near the edge. "There it is," Sullivan said, pretending to be surprised. "What do you know, a bag of powdery goodness." Talia glanced at the bag, then back at the officers, her face calm. Inside, though, her mind was racing. She knew the bag hadn't been there when she left her house. This was a setup. Carter stepped closer, smirking. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curved into a faint smile, a calculated expression that showed neither fear nor guilt. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said. Carter chuckled, clearly thinking her calmness was arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Sullivan moved to cuff her, Talia didn't resist. Her gaze stayed steady and unflinching. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Sullivan hesitate for a moment before snapping the cuffs into place. "Yeah, we'll see," Carter said, leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove away, Talia looked out the window, her mind already working through her options. The two officers might think they'd made an easy arrest, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the station was quiet and tense, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, her face calm. The glow of passing streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face, but her eyes stayed focused on the road ahead. Inside, her thoughts were sharp and deliberate. She replayed every moment of the encounter in her mind, piecing it together like a puzzle. The stop sign that didn't exist, the officer's smug confidence, the planted bag, it wasn't just random corruption. It was planned and rehearsed. These weren't mistakes, they were choices. Officer Carter glanced at Talia in the rearview mirror, a faint smirk on his face. "You don't seem too worried," he said, breaking the silence, his voice with a mocking tone, as if he was trying to provoke her. Talia met his eyes through the mirror, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Should I be?" Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen a lot of people act tough, but it never lasts long in the holding cell." Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew men like Carter all too well, men who were used to power, bending the rules, and getting away with it. For now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last. When they arrived at the station, it was quiet. The night shift officers lounged behind their desks, sipping coffee and chatting in low voices. Carter and Sullivan led Talia inside. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare on the scuffed floors and peeling paint on the walls. "Got ourselves a big one tonight," Carter announced loudly, his voice full of bravado. The other officers looked up, their interest piqued. Sullivan tossed the bag of powder onto the counter with a dramatic flourish. "Caught her red-handed," he added. "Looks like she's been running more than stop signs." Talia stayed silent, her eyes scanning the room. She noted the placement of every camera, the layout of the desks, and the casual camaraderie among the officers. It was a small station, the kind where everyone knew each other, a network of shared secrets and unspoken rules. They led Talia to a fingerprinting station, where Carter removed the cuffs and told her to press her hands onto the ink pad. She did as she was told, calm and deliberate. The officer working the station, a younger man with tired eyes, hesitated as he looked at her, as if sensing something wasn't right. "Name?" he asked, his tone almost apologetic. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" Talia paused for a moment, thinking carefully. "Consultant," she said finally. It was vague enough to avoid suspicion but true enough to not be a lie. The younger officer nodded and kept typing, though he still seemed uneasy. Carter and Sullivan, however, were oblivious. They leaned against the counter, laughing quietly, enjoying the moment. "Lawyer," Talia said suddenly, her voice cutting through their laughter like a knife. Both men turned toward her, their smug expressions faltering for a second. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter said, his tone darkening. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." Talia's cell was cold and dimly lit. The metal bench was bolted to the wall, offering little comfort. The bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She sat on the bench, her back straight, her posture unyielding. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. Carter lingered for a moment, watching her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said, almost casually. "But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she said, her tone calm but sharp. Carter shifted uncomfortably, muttered something under his breath, and walked away, leaving her alone. Talia leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew her next steps had to be precise. This wasn't just about her freedom, it was about exposing something much bigger. The quiet of the cell was broken only by the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Talia waited, her patience born of years in the field. She knew her absence would be noticed soon, and when it was, there would be questions. Her team would find her, they always did. In the meantime, she had to play the part, the calm detainee, the unremarkable woman with nothing to hide. Every passing moment was another chance to observe and gather information. She noted the footsteps of the night shift officers as they passed her cell, their routines and patterns. She listened for the faint beeping of the station's computers and the crackle of the radio. Every detail mattered. When the time came, she would be ready. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan said, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well, that'll change," Carter replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's going to dig too deep. Besides," Sullivan added, "we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering nearby, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, but he kept his mouth shut. In this station, questioning senior officers wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The hours ticked by, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every minute was another step closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The storm was coming, and Talia was its quiet eye. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of Talia's cell, casting a muted glow on the old concrete walls. The station was coming to life as the day shift officers began their routines. Talia listened carefully, noting the distinct tones and footsteps, little details that revealed more about the people working there. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door, followed by heavy boots echoing down the hallway. Talia didn't flinch as Officer Sullivan appeared in front of her cell, holding a clipboard and wearing his usual smirk. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "Sleep okay, or was the cot not fancy enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without a word, her silence unsettling him more than he'd care to admit. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing down at his clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." She tilted her head, her expression calm but unyielding. "Good to know," she replied softly. Sullivan frowned, the confidence in his smirk faltering for a split second. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered before turning and walking away. Talia leaned back against the wall, her gaze following him as he disappeared down the hallway. The cracks in their facade were starting to show. All she needed was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller, young, eager, and fresh out of the academy, watched Sullivan stride through the station. Something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with Keller. He'd processed dozens of arrests in his few months on the job, but this one felt different. The suspect, Talia Porter, hadn't acted like anyone Keller had ever seen. She wasn't defiant or aggressive, but she wasn't scared either. Her calm demeanor, her deliberate words, they weren't normal. And then there was the bag of drugs. It was almost too convenient, sitting right there in the trunk like a gift-wrapped package. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He knew the unwritten rules of the station: you didn't question senior officers, but the doubt gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake it. He glanced at the surveillance monitors mounted above his desk. The live feed showed the hallway outside Talia's cell. She was sitting on the bench, still as a statue, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, a tiny spark of resolve flickering within him. While Keller wrestled with his conscience, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were trained on the camera positioned outside her cell. It was an old model, likely outdated and poorly maintained. The station's budget, she guessed, didn't prioritize state-of-the-art surveillance. She waited until the hallway was clear, then shifted slightly on the bench, her movements deliberate but subtle. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. She pressed her hand against the fabric, triggering the device with a barely perceptible click. The tracker sent a silent signal, a beacon that would reach her team within moments. She didn't need to speak or explain, they would know what to do. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sipped their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking we're going to crack," Carter said, shaking his head. "They always think they can talk their way out of it." Sullivan chuckled. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Carter leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face. "You know what I like about this job? The predictability." Carter and Sullivan laughed in the break room, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside their understanding. "You see the same types over and over," Carter said, smirking. "They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Meanwhile, at a nearby office, a phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out to answer it. "Signal received," the voice on the other end said, calmly but firmly. "Location confirmed. Deploying resources." In her cell, Talia leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She could almost feel her team moving into action, quietly and precisely. Every second brought her closer to the moment when everything would change. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, a smile that held no joy, only quiet certainty. The officers had no idea what was coming. The station buzzed with its usual morning activity. Officers filed reports, answered calls, and chatted over coffee. For everyone except Talia, Carter, and Sullivan, it was just another day. For Carter and Sullivan, it felt like a victory lap. Talia sat motionless in her cell, calm and composed. Through the bars, she could see snippets of the station's activity, shadows passing, bits of conversation, but she stayed focused. She knew how to blend into the background, to stay invisible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago, and she trusted her team completely. But she also knew they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was critical. In the meantime, she needed to plant seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Keller kept glancing at the monitors showing Talia's cell. She hadn't moved much since her arrest, but something about her demeanor bothered him. It wasn't fear or defiance, emotions he was used to seeing in detainees. It was patience, a quiet confidence that didn't fit someone accused of drug trafficking. Unable to shake his unease, Keller pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license and address were straightforward, but there was a gap in her employment history. The system listed her most recent job as independent consultant, with no further details. Frowning, Keller minimized the file and glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were laughing over donuts. Their carefree attitude made him uneasy. Against his better judgment, Keller decided to take a closer look at the arrest report. He clicked through the digital records, scanning the narrative Carter and Sullivan had provided. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection, Keller muttered under his breath, reading aloud. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk of the vehicle. Something didn't add up. Keller had been trained to recognize patterns of deception, and while the report followed procedure on the surface, it felt too tidy, too scripted. His internal conflict grew as the hours passed. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing toward Talia's cell more and more often. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Talia looked up, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "Yes?" Keller hesitated, his hand resting on his belt. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" Talia's tone was calm but pointed. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked. Keller swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice faltering. "That's what they're counting on," Talia replied, her gaze steady. "Men like Carter and Sullivan, they rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face flushed, and he stepped back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Talia saw the hesitation in his steps, the conflict etched into his features. The seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arlington, a plain black sedan pulled up outside a nondescript building. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, flanked by two agents. Their movements were deliberate and professional. "ETA on extraction," one of the agents asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across several monitors. One screen showed Talia in her cell, sitting perfectly still. Another displayed the front desk, where Keller was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent observed. "Good," the man replied. "We'll use it when the time comes." In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. "You see Keller earlier," he said to Sullivan. Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sullivan smirked, shaking his head. "Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy, they always get jumpy around the first big case." "Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions," Carter said, his tone darkening. Sullivan shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is all there, and she's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Carter nodded, but a faint flicker of unease crossed his face. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Keller's doubts could spread. As the day wore on, the tension in the station began to rise. Talia could feel it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. She knew her team was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Keller's footsteps echoed down the hall again, slower this time. He paused outside her cell, his expression conflicted. "You said they're counting on people like me," he said quietly. "What did you mean by that?" Talia's gaze was steady. "You know exactly what I mean," she said. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Keller stared at her for a long moment before walking away, his shoulders tense. Back in the operations room, the suited man watched Keller's retreat on the monitor. A faint smile crossed his lips. "He's close," he said. "One more push." One of the agents glanced at him, and the man's smile widened. "Then we turn this whole thing upside down." Keller sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the edge as he stared at his monitor. The digital file on Talia Porter remained open, the words blurring as his mind churned. He felt a knot forming in his chest, a sensation that had been growing since the arrest. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Keller glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still laughing. Their carefree attitudes grated against his growing unease. The station felt heavier than usual, the walls pressing in like silent witnesses to something unspoken. His thoughts kept drifting back to the holding cell, to Talia's words, "That's what they're counting on." Her voice had been calm and deliberate, as if she knew exactly how to get under his skin. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Keller's doubt turned into quiet resolve. He needed answers, but he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. As a rookie, his reputation already made him a target for teasing. Any signs of questioning authority could isolate him even more. He waited until Carter and Sullivan left the room, then slipped into the records archive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. Keller logged into the system, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for past cases tied to Carter and Sullivan. Their names popped up repeatedly, attached to arrests that followed a disturbingly similar pattern, minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. Most of the defendants were people of color, and most were convicted. The knot in Keller's chest tightened. Back in her cell, Talia remained still, her body a picture of calm. She had spent years training her mind to thrive in moments like this, when the waiting was long and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she watched Keller's shadow move past her cell. His pacing was slower now, his steps more deliberate. She could sense his conflict, the internal war raging within him. He was close to breaking the cycle of blind loyalty that men like Carter and Sullivan relied on. She shifted slightly on the bench, letting her movements catch his attention. He stopped, turning to face her. "Officer Keller," she said, her voice soft but commanding. He hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the wall like it was a lifeline. "What?" he asked, his voice low, almost defensive. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Something that doesn't add up." Keller swallowed hard. "I can't," he stopped, his voice catching. "I'm just trying to do my job." "And what is your job, exactly?" Talia pressed. "To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong?" Keller's jaw tightened, his eyes darting down the hallway. "You don't understand how things work around here," he said. "I understand more than you think," Talia replied, her gaze unwavering. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you don't have a choice. But you do, Keller. You always have a choice." Keller walked away, but her words followed him like a shadow. He returned to his desk, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He stared at the list of cases tied to Carter and Sullivan, his stomach twisting with each new name he read. Finally, he made a decision. Keller opened a secure email channel and typed a message, his fingers moving faster as his resolve solidified. He attached the case files he had found, along with a note, "To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help." He hit send, his heart pounding as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it or if they would even care, but it was the first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup resting on his knee. Carter glanced at Sullivan. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" he asked. Sullivan shrugged. "Kid's always weird. What's he going to do, rat us out?" Carter smirked, but his eyes narrowed. "Still, keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." That afternoon, as the station buzzed with activity, a plain black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Inside, Talia's team prepared for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email, just as planned, and now they had what they needed to act. "Let's make this clean," the team leader said, adjusting his tie. "No unnecessary disruptions. We need to expose this from the inside." As they stepped out of the car, the sun glinted off their badges. FBI. Inside her cell, Talia smiled faintly as the station door opened and the agents walked in. She couldn't see them from where she sat, but she didn't need to. She knew her team had arrived. The storm was no longer brewing, it was here. The hum of the station fell into an awkward silence as the agents stepped inside. Their movements were calm and deliberate, their black suits crisp and their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, approached the front desk. His eyes scanned the room with quiet authority. Officer Keller, seated nearby, froze mid-typing. His heart began to race. He wasn't sure if it was fear, relief, or both. He watched as the lead agent leaned slightly over the desk, speaking low enough that the surrounding officers couldn't hear. The desk sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, straightened up, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice wary. "Federal investigation," the agent replied, his tone steady and clipped. "We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." The sergeant hesitated, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual, disruptive even, but there was no protocol for outright denial. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Follow me." From his desk, Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew, deep down, that the email he'd sent had triggered this, but he hadn't expected a response so soon or so visible. His gaze flicked toward Carter and Sullivan, who were standing near the breakroom door. Their laughter had died, replaced by hushed whispers and furrowed brows. Carter's eyes locked onto Keller for a split second, and the rookie quickly looked away, focusing on his screen. The air in the station had changed, thick with a tension that felt almost suffocating. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a small, dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent rolled in a cart carrying a portable server and hard drives. They wasted no time, plugging into the station's network and began sifting through its digital archives. Price leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching as lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitor. "Anything?" he asked. The tech agent, a younger woman with sharp eyes, nodded. "Plenty." Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, repeated arrests, identical narratives, gaps in procedure. This isn't just bad policing, it's systemic. Price's jaw tightened. Pull everything. I want every record, every report, and every piece of evidence tied to those two. In her cell, Talia heard the faint murmur of activity beyond the hallway. She could feel the shift, the subtle ripple that signaled her team's presence. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting on her lap. The cuffs she'd worn earlier had left faint red marks on her wrists, but she didn't pay them any mind. Her focus was on the moment ahead, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. In the break room, Carter paced back and forth, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Sullivan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching his partner with a growing sense of unease. Sullivan finally broke the silence in the break room. "You think this is about her?" he asked, his voice low. Carter stopped pacing and glared at him. "Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. "You think they know?" Carter scoffed, but there was no confidence in his voice. "No, there's nothing to know. Everything we did was by the book." "Yeah," Sullivan muttered, "sure." Agent Price emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two other agents. He carried a folder filled with printed reports, the weight of evidence in his hands. He made his way through the station, his expression unreadable as he approached the bullpen. His gaze locked onto Carter and Sullivan, who froze mid-conversation. The agents moved with purpose, positioning themselves like sentinels around the room. "Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan," Price said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "We need to speak with you." Carter tried to play it cool, forcing a smirk as he stepped forward. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual. "We've got nothing to hide." Price didn't blink. "Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions." The room fell silent as the agents led the two officers toward the same interrogation room they had occupied moments earlier. Keller watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He could see the cracks forming in Carter's facade, the tension in Sullivan's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked more like cornered animals. Minutes later, another agent arrived at Talia's cell. The door buzzed open, and the agent stepped inside, his face neutral but his tone respectful. "Miss Porter," he said, "you're free to go." Talia stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out of the cell. The hallway seemed brighter now, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As Talia passed by Keller's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, the words caught in his throat. She stopped, turning to face him fully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room doors closed behind Carter and Sullivan, and the sound of raised voices soon followed. Talia watched from the station's entrance as the agents methodically dismantled the officers' lies. The storm she had waited for was finally here, and it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat at a small metal table, their posture stiff. Agent Price stood across from them, his hands resting on a stack of documents. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. "So," Price began, his tone measured, "do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence?" Sullivan flinched, his eyes darting toward Carter. "We don't know what you're talking about," Carter said firmly, his voice laced with defiance. Price didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder and pulled out a series of printed photos. He slid them across the table one by one, images from the station's security cameras, showing Carter and Sullivan holding the unmarked bag before Talia's car was searched. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "We were securing evidence." Price raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Really?" "Because these timestamps show otherwise. And we have audio recordings, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device, capturing your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her." Sullivan paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't use that," he sputtered. "That's entrapment." Price smirked, shaking his head. "No, it's justice. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've pulled records from your past arrests, dozens of cases with eerily similar patterns. All of them are under review. But let me make one thing clear, you're not walking out of here today." Carter's confidence crumbled, his shoulders slumping. Sullivan buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions finally hitting them. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching everything unfold. He had been called into the interrogation room earlier to confirm details about the station's processes. For the first time, he felt the heavy gaze of Carter and Sullivan as they realized someone from within had spoken up. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Keller stood, his hands trembling slightly. He approached Price, clearing his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. Price looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "Now we clean house. And you," he paused, studying Keller's face, "you did the right thing." Keller nodded, a small wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since joining the force, he felt a sense of purpose. Talia stood near the station's entrance, watching as Carter and Sullivan were let out in handcuffs. The once smug officers now looked defeated, their eyes downcast as they were escorted past their colleagues. The station buzzed with quiet murmurs, officers exchanging stunned glances as the reality of the situation sank in. Agent Price approached Talia, his expression neutral but respectful. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your work here is done." Talia nodded, her composure unbroken. "Good. Make sure it sticks." Price smiled faintly. "It will." As Talia stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, carrying with it a sense of finality. The weight she had carried for weeks began to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. In the days that followed, the fallout from the investigation sent shockwaves through the town. Carter and Sullivan's arrests were headline news, their faces plastered across every screen. The charges against Talia were formally dropped, and the cases tied to the officers' misconduct were reopened. The station underwent a massive overhaul, with several officers resigning under scrutiny. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, received mixed reactions from his colleagues, but he held his head high, knowing he had made the right choice. Weeks later, Talia sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The autumn leaves rustled around her, their vibrant colors a reminder of change. She had returned to her quiet life, her mission complete, but the experience lingered in her mind. Agent Price joined her, his presence a rare moment of camaraderie. "You could have handled this differently," he said, sitting down beside her. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "And missed the look on their faces?" "No thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. For Talia, the storm had passed, but the impact of her actions would ripple on, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for now. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrest, every local and national outlet had picked up the story. "Police corruption exposed, FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington," read the bold headline on one major news site. Footage of the officers being let out in handcuffs played on a loop, their faces grim, stripped of the arrogance they had worn so openly. Talia Porter's name was kept out of the media intentionally, a calculated decision by her team. The focus needed to remain on the systemic issues at the station and the actions of the officers involved, not on her role in uncovering the truth. She preferred it that way. She had no interest in fame, only results. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their lawyers. Their arrogance had melted into desperation, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The charges against them were overwhelming: falsifying reports, planting evidence, and abusing their authority in dozens of cases. "This is bad," Sullivan muttered, his voice shaking. "They've got everything: audio, video, the files. What do we do?" Carter, usually the more confident of the two, sat in silence, his jaw clenched. "We fight it," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice was weak. But their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations revealed more officers involved in similar practices, and resignations poured in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference, emphasizing a commitment to transparency and reform, but the damage to the department's reputation was already done. Keller found himself at the center of attention, both praised and ostracized for his role in bringing the corruption to light. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard still intact, while others quietly expressed their support. Keller didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Keller in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted, his voice low. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this conversation," she said. "Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at the table, his expression conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way," he said. "But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Carter and Sullivan, there are more of them out there." "It made a difference to the people they hurt," Talia replied firmly. "And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens now?" Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Months later, Carter and Sullivan stood in court, their fates sealed. They pled guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed. For the first time, they faced the consequences of their actions. The cases they had built on lies were overturned, and innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders rallied for deeper reforms, using the scandal as a catalyst for change. In a quiet moment, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already focused on the road ahead. The phone on the counter buzzed, and she picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Talia smiled faintly. "Always." As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, the door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed. And that, for her, was enough. And so, the truth came to light, and justice was served. The corrupt officers who thought they could get away with their crimes faced the consequences of their actions, while the woman they tried to frame emerged victorious, stronger than ever. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to shine through. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications at Black Struggles. Your support means the world and helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.